I remember this one time, a friend of mine told me about something that happened to her cousin. She was home alone one evening, just chilling out, watching TV. Her parents were out at some party, and she had the whole house to herself. Everything was cool, until she heard this weird noise coming from upstairs. At first, she thought it was just the house settling or something. You know, those random creaks and groans old houses make. But then, she heard it again, louder this time, like someone was walking around up there. She froze, listening intently, hoping it was just her imagination. But then she heard it again, unmistakably footsteps. She freaked out, not knowing what to do. She considered calling the cops, but she didn't want to overreact. So, she grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and slowly crept up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. When she got to the top, she saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, just watching her. She couldn't make out any features, just this dark silhouette against the dim light. She froze, terror coursing through her veins. But then, the figure started moving towards her, slowly at first, then picking up speed. She panicked and swung the bat, connecting with something solid. There was a sickening thud, and the figure collapsed to the ground. She stood there, shaking, her hands trembling around the bat. She didn't dare look at what she had hit. Instead, she ran downstairs and called the cops. When they arrived, they searched the house, but found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no intruder, nothing. They told her it was probably just her imagination, that she had imagined the whole thing. But she knew what she saw, what she felt, and she never felt safe in that house again. She moved out soon after, unable to shake the feeling that she was never truly alone. After moving out, she tried to put the whole ordeal behind her. She moved into a new apartment, got a dog for company, and installed a security system just to ease her mind. But even with all these precautions, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Months went by, and she started to relax, convincing herself that it was all just a one-time thing. Until one night, when she woke up to the sound of scratching at her bedroom door. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the scratching grew louder and more insistent. She mustered up the courage to get out of bed and approach the door. She could hear heavy breathing on the other side, sending chills down her spine. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob, her mind racing with fear. When she opened the door, she found nothing but darkness and silence. She flicked on the lights, expecting to see her dog or maybe a draft causing the noise. But there was nothing there, just an empty hallway bathed in the glow of the hallway light. She closed the door and went back to bed, trying to convince herself that it was all in her head. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the shadows. The next morning, she woke up to find scratches on her bedroom door, deep gouges in the wood as if someone or something had been desperately trying to get in. She felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach as she realized that whatever had happened in her old house was happening again. She called the police, but just like last time, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder. They chalked it up to a prank or maybe a wild animal, but she knew better. She knew that whatever was haunting her was real and it wasn't going away. Terrified, she reached out to a friend who recommended a medium. Someone who could communicate with the spirits and maybe help her make sense of what was happening. Desperate for answers, she agreed to meet with the medium, hoping against hope that they could help her put an end to the nightmare. The medium arrived at her apartment and immediately sensed a dark energy lingering in the air. They conducted a seance, calling out to any spirits that might be present, and that's when things took a terrifying turn. A voice whispered through darkness, chilling her to the bone. It spoke of unfinished business, of a soul trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. It spoke of a past injustice, a betrayal that had left a mark on the spirit's soul. As the seance continued, the medium revealed the truth behind the haunting. It turned out that her old house was built on land that had once been the site of a brutal murder. The spirit of the victim had never found peace, forever trapped in a cycle of torment and revenge. The medium offered to help the spirit move on to finally find peace in the afterlife. With tears in her eyes, she agreed, desperate to end the nightmare once and for all. Together, They performed a ritual to release the spirit from its earthly bonds, and as they did, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. From that day on, haunting stopped. The scratches on her door disappeared, and she finally felt like she could breathe again. But the experience left its mark on her, a reminder that sometimes the things we can't see are the most terrifying of all, and she knew that she would never truly be alone again. It was late at night, and I was alone in my house. My parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me to fend for myself. I was used to being home alone, but this time felt different. There was an eerie silence that hung in the air, making me feel uneasy. So I tried to shake off the feeling and went about my usual routine. I made myself some dinner and settled down on the couch to watch TV. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, I started to hear strange noises coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking around, but I knew I was the only one home. My heart started to race as fear gripped me tight. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the noises grew louder and more persistent. I knew I had to investigate, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to stay put. Slowly, I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. With each step, the noises grew louder until they were almost deafening. I reached the top of the stairs and hesitated for a moment before mustering up the courage to continue. I made my way down the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The noises seemed to be coming from my parents' bedroom, and as I approached the door, I could hear the sound of whispering. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to make out what was being said. It was impossible to discern any words, but the tone sounded urgent and frantic. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob, my mind racing with fear. I pushed the door open slowly, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. Standing in the middle of the room was a figure dressed in tattered clothes, its face obscured by shadows. It seemed to be muttering to itself, oblivious to my presence. I wanted to scream, to run as far away as possible, but fear rooted me to the spot. I stood there frozen, watching as the figure continued to move around the room, its movements jerky and unnatural. Suddenly, it stopped and turned to face me. Its eyes piercing through the darkness. I could feel its gaze boring into me, sending waves of terror coursing through my body. Without a word, the figure began to advance towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs refused to move. Just as the figure was about to reach me, I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around in terror. It was my parents, home earlier than expected. They could see the fear in my eyes and immediately rushed to comfort me. I tried to explain what I had seen, but they dismissed it as a figment of my imagination. They assured me that everything was okay and tucked me into bed before leaving me alone once again. But try as I might, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And to this day, I still can't explain what happened that night or shake the feeling of dread that haunts me whenever I'm home alone. As the days passed after that terrifying night, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to go about my daily routine as if nothing had happened, but the memory of that figure in my parents' bedroom haunted me constantly. I found it increasingly difficult to sleep at night, my mind plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures lurking in the darkness. My parents noticed the change in me and grew concerned, but no matter how hard I tried to explain what had happened, they dismissed it as nothing more than a product of an overactive imagination. They assured me that our house was safe and that I had nothing to fear. But try as I might, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that hung over me like a dark cloud. I became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every little noise and constantly checking over my shoulder as if expecting to see that figure lurking in the shadows. One night, as I lay in bed trying desperately to fall asleep, I heard the familiar sound of whispering coming from outside my bedroom door. My heart skipped a beat as fear gripped me once again. I knew I had to investigate, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay put. I summoned every ounce of courage I had and slowly made my way out of bed. The hallway was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the moon filtering in through the windows. I crept towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the doorknob, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut with a loud bang, causing me to jump in fright. I stood there frozen for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew I had to open the door and confront whatever was on the other side, but fear held me rooted to the spot. After what felt like an eternity, I finally mustered up the courage to reach for the doorknob once again. With trembling hands, I turned it slowly and pushed the door open, my heart racing in my chest. What I saw on the other side sent chills down my spine. Standing in the hallway was the same figure I had seen in my parents' bedroom that fateful night. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, sending waves of terror coursing through my body. I wanted to scream, to run as far away as possible, but fear held me in its grip. I stood there frozen, unable to move as the figure began to advance towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. Just as it was about to reach me, a voice echoed through the darkness, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Leave this place," it said, its tone cold and menacing. I looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the voice, but all I could see was darkness. The figure stopped in its tracks, its eyes narrowing as if considering its next move. "Leave this place," the voice repeated, this time louder and more insistent. And with that, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the darkness once again. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Had I imagined the whole thing, or had something truly sinister been lurking in the shadows of my home? I didn't have time to dwell on it for long, as the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. With a newfound sense of urgency, I raced down the hallway and out the front door, not stopping until I was a safe distance away from the house. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath as adrenaline coursed through my veins. I lay there, catching my breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and malevolent had been lurking in the shadows of my home. And though I had escaped with my life, I knew that the terror was far from over. It was a night much like any other. I was home alone, lounging on the couch, flipping through channels aimlessly. The house was quiet, the only sounds being the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creaking of the floorboards. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, a scratching noise pierced through the silence. At first, I ignored it, attributing it to the house settling or perhaps a stray branch scraping against a window. But as it persisted, growing louder and more insistent, a feeling of unease crept over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone in the house. With a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, I got up from the couch and followed the sound to its source. As I approached the room where the noise was coming from, my heart began to race. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure of what I would find on the other side. But ultimately, curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the dim light of the room, stood a figure hunched over in the corner. It was humanoid in shape, but its movements were jagged, unnatural. It seemed to be muttering to itself, the words unintelligible but filled with malice. I stood frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the sight before me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the figure stopped its muttering and turned to face me. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, empty and soulless. I could feel its gaze boring into me, piercing through to the core of my being. Without warning, it lunged towards me, its movements quick and predatory. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I turned and ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my neighbor's house, where I collapsed in a trembling heap. To this day, I still don't know what that thing was or why it was in my house. All I know is that It was a nightmarish experience that I never want to relive. It was a true Home Alone horror story, one that will haunt me for the rest of my days. After that harrowing encounter, I struggled to make sense of what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even when I was surrounded by people. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking menace. Every creak of the house sent shivers down my spine. I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, that there was a rational explanation for what I had seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever that thing was, it was real, and it had been in my house. I became obsessed with finding answers, scouring the internet for any mention of similar experiences. I came across countless stories of encounters with entities that defied explanation, each one more terrifying than the last. But none of them seemed to match exactly what I had experienced. In my desperation, I reached out to paranormal investigators and experts in the occult, hoping that they could shed some light on the situation. But most of them dismissed my story as nothing more than a hoax or a hallucination. Frustrated and frightened, I turned to more unconventional methods of seeking answers. I consulted psychics and mediums, hoping that they could communicate with whatever had invaded my home. But their messages were cryptic and vague, leaving me with more questions than answers. As the days turned into weeks, my fear began to consume me. I became paranoid, jumping at the slightest noise and avoiding being alone in the house whenever possible. Sleep became elusive, haunted by nightmares of that nightmarish figure lurking in the shadows. But just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, something happened that changed everything. One night, as I lay awake in bed, unable to sleep for fear of what lurked in the darkness, I heard a faint tapping at my window. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or a tree branch brushing against the glass. But the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I forced myself to get out of bed and investigate. As I approached the window, my heart began to race. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the curtain, unsure of what I would find on the other side. But ultimately, curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled back the curtain. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing outside my window, was the same figure I had encountered in my house. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. Without thinking, I stumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet and falling to the ground. I scrambled to get away, but it was no use. The figure was already upon me, its hands reaching out to grab me. In that moment of terror, I thought it was the end. I thought I was going to die, torn apart by whatever malevolent force had invaded my life. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the darkness. So I lay there for what felt like hours, trembling and gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was only when the first light of dawn began to creep through the window that I found the courage to get up and face the day. From that moment on, the figure never returned. Whether it was driven away by some unknown force or simply lost interest in tormenting me, I'll never know. But one thing is for certain. That night will stay with me forever, a reminder of the true horrors that can lurk in the shadows, waiting to strike when you least expect it. I woke up in the dead of night to the sound of my parents' car pulling out of the driveway. They were leaving for a late-night emergency, leaving me alone in the house. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, I'm a teenager and being home alone isn't exactly new to me. But this time, something felt different. I shrugged it off and decided to watch some TV to pass the time. As I was flipping through channels, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see someone standing outside, but there was nothing there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the tapping persisted, growing louder and more frantic with each passing moment. My mind raced with all sorts of possibilities. Maybe it was just a tree branch blowing in the wind or an animal trying to get in. But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. I mustered up the courage to approach the window and peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, illuminated by the dim moonlight, was a figure standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I stumbled back in horror, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police, wake up the neighbors, or should I just hide and hope it goes away? But before I could make a decision, the figure began to move, slowly making its way towards the front door. Panic set in as I realized it was trying to get inside. I raced through the house, locking doors and windows as quickly as I could, but it was no use. The figure was already at the front door, pounding on it with a force that shook the entire house. I backed away, fear consuming every fiber of my being. I was trapped, alone and defenseless, against whatever was on the other side of that door. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. Silence engulfed the house, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing for what felt like an eternity. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The figure was gone, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of dread. To this day, I still don't know what that thing was or why it chose to target me. All I know is that I'll never forget the sheer terror of being home alone that night and the chilling realization that sometimes the things we fear the most are the ones we can't see coming. As the minutes turned into hours, I found myself unable to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me like a thick fog. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows sent shivers down my spine. I desperately wished my parents would return home soon, but with each passing moment, it felt like they were drifting further and further away. I debated calling them, but something held me back. What if I startled them while they were driving? What if it distracted them from the road, leading to an even worse outcome? So I waited, my anxiety mounting with each tick of the clock. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it, the sound of the front door unlocking. Relief flooded through me as I rushed to greet my parents. But as I swung open the door, my heart plummeted. Standing before me wasn't my mom or dad, but the same shadowy figure from before, its eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. I stumbled back in shock. My mind reeling with confusion and fear. How had it gotten inside? What did it want from me? I searched for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself, but my hands came up empty. The figure advanced towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. I could feel its presence weighing down on me like a suffocating blanket, filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. I knew I had to do something, anything, to protect myself. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged forward, pushing past the figure and darting out the door. I ran blindly through the night, not stopping until I was far away from that accursed house. When I finally slowed to a stop, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? Or had I truly come face to face with something beyond my understanding? But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new emotion washed over me. Determination. I refused to let fear dictate my life any longer. With a newfound resolve, I picked myself up off the ground and began the long journey back home. As I approached the house, I felt a sense of trepidation gnawing at the pit of my stomach, but I refused to let it hold me back. I squared my shoulders and pushed open the door, ready to confront whatever lay on the other side. But to my surprise, the house was empty. There was no sign of the shadowy figure or any other intruder. It was as if the events of that night had never happened. Confusion swirled in my mind as I searched every room, half expecting the figure to jump out at me at any moment. But there was nothing, no trace of the terror that had plagued me just hours before. I wanted to believe it was all just a nightmare, a trick of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever had happened that night was real, and it had changed me in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. From that day forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the shadowy figure was still out there somewhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But I refused to let it control me. I refused to be a victim. Instead, I chose to face my fears head-on, to live my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the terror threatened to overwhelm me, but I refused to let it win. And so, I learned to embrace the darkness, to find strength in the face of adversity, because in the end, the true measure of courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to confront it and emerge victorious. So, if you ever find yourself alone in the dead of night, with nothing but your fears for company, remember this: you are stronger than you think, braver than you know. And no matter what horrors may lurk in the shadows, you have the power to overcome them.